Hi, I'm Lynette Gunther, and I'm a realtor with the Onyx real estate company powered by KWDTC. So before we get started, don't forget to hit the bell to subscribe, comment, like our channel. We deliver content every Thursday. So now let's take a look at what's not so good. So we're taking a look at what's good, what's not so good, and the risks. So what's not so good? There's actually a lot of negative news that sellers need to pay attention to right now because the risk and the downside may be huge. So the first thing we're going to talk about is our unemployment shock. We have almost 41 million Americans unemployed since the start of the COVID crisis. That's a big number. In fact, the biggest number ever recorded. So the stats are we were at 14.7%. Now it's down to 13.5. Depends on where your resources are, what day. The other thing to consider around this is we have a continued rise in unemployment claims. So we see the unemployment number go down, but we're still seeing a rise in claims, which may be what paints a more accurate picture. So we have the data, and then have we considered that, does this count the number of people who've completely given up and dropped out of the workforce? So that we have unemployment benefits, if you can get them, but they're temporary. And finally, people typically need jobs to buy homes. So we have the unemployment consideration. Then we have a wall potential business bankruptcy looming on the horizon. The commercial climate is kind of sketchy right now. So as businesses open, we're looking at I'm just looking at these numbers. It's fascinating, 35 to 40 million people back to work, and it just doesn't happen overnight. It's logistics. So when the economy was good, we saw job growth of about 200,000 jobs a month. So in a good economy, we had that kind of job growth. Let's say we double the ability to bring on 400,000 jobs a month. When we're looking at 35 or 40 million people, it could take up to 8.5 years or 102.5 months to funnel them back into the workforce. So those are very real, practical considerations on what it's going to take to get back to where we were. So some economists estimate that a large number of businesses that closed for COVID-19 may never reopen. Does that mean that number of jobs aren't coming back? What are those millions of people going to do for work? So ultimately, when we're talking about, and we are talking about, is it the right time to sell? Should I wait to sell? What's the best time to sell? People will generally need a loan to buy a house. So if they're unemployed, that's generally not available. So if they're unemployed, then we have an increased level of personal bankruptcy. So that's another thing to talk about. So interestingly, and I found this to be a fascinating data point, there's a near perfect correlation between quarterly bankruptcy filings and unemployment filings. It makes sense. If you're unemployed, you're in a situation. So considering the drastic unemployment spike, it stands to reason that a bankruptcy surge may follow in the next 3 to 4 months. So that's not a great sign for future home sales. People need to finance. 86% of home buyers finance to purchase their home. So that's a very real possibility that we're going to have a segment of the population that can't buy later. Something to consider. So historically, we've known that there are 3 pillars of the economy that support a strong housing market: low unemployment, wages that are rising, and a rise in consistent, stable rise in consumer spending. So post-COVID-19, we're suddenly missing all 3. So we know the unemployment rate's high. We know wages are shrinking because there's a supply-demand component with the employers that are able to keep their staff. And consumers aren't spending like they used to, and they probably won't return because there's uncertainty. There's always uncertainty, but there's a level now that's very different than what we've generally experienced with what's to come. So the lack of consumer spending has a trickle-down effect. So the tax revenues will go down. So it will force governments to look at their budgets and cut expenses. And as we know, one of the most substantial expenses are their employee salaries. And it goes on and on and on. So we know all this, and we also know that the Fed is providing stimulus to try to avoid a potential deflationary spiral. The question is, will it be enough? And there's no way anybody can answer that right now. We're just going to have to wait and see. So we've talked a little bit about a buyer's ability to obtain lending. So I'm going to go back to it a little bit. You know, with all this going on, obviously buyers are going to need to get to find the money to buy your house. Lending standards are tightening even further. So even right now, the investors and underwriters in Wall Street have tightened it up such that approximately 20% of the buyers that are looking to buy have been knocked out of the market so far, and that's fluctuating. It's actually changing day by day, but it's a response to the uncertainty. So there's no certainty of the uncertainty, so we can't really predict that. Yet when we see this as things go along, ultimately the time will consistently weaken buyer demand. I mean, if they can't find the money to buy, they're not going to buy. So this is another interesting statistic. There's forbearance. So about 4.7 million homeowners are currently in forbearance. That represents about 8.8% of US mortgages. So forbearance means that a homeowner with a mortgage can request or delay foreclosure for 180 days. After the 180 days, they can request an extension for an additional 180 days. So if these homeowners can't find employment in that gap, meaning the 6 to 12 months, they'll have to sell their homes to preserve equity. So that means that if all these homeowners are going on the market, you as a seller are going to have a real tight position in competition. So there's low inventory now, but does that mean that will continue? Supply demand. So we got a lot of information. The important thing, like, where's this leave you? What's the good, the bad, the risks? So where's this leave you, the home seller? So right now, housing has some momentum right now. For how long? We don't know. We still have low inventory for now. There's a solid demand. We still have multiple offer situations in a number of market segments, and people are calling me to see when listings are coming on board. And that's a great sign for a seller. And we still have strong pricing for now. So we have potential. We also have potential for a number of headwinds in the coming months. The unemployment's obvious. We've got personal and business bankruptcies that are logically looming. There's tighter lending standards, and we haven't even gotten to the point where people are having to address possible mortgage default. So when we look at all this, is it likely your home price is going to go up dramatically in the next year or two? Probably not. I mean, I think if anything, we're going to be in a really steep competition situation. And if you're thinking about selling and you want to pull as much equity out, I think that's a strong consideration. So could your home price potentially drop given what's going on around us? Yes, absolutely. I mean, unless somebody says they're Houdini or something, they're not going to be able to tell you, but we need to look at the information we actually have right now. So when we take a look at the risks to the downside are huge. Housing prices are typically the last to fall when we see an economic or market condition, and we've already seen signs of slowing momentum well prior to the COVID-19 situation. The industry indicator, which we haven't talked about at all, is to watch unit sales. So, okay, so I'm sitting in my kitchen, I'm like, what are my unit sales? You know, there's something to look at, and you can get that information. Yet the pertinence of a unit sale, how many houses are selling, is that when we see unit sales, the number of unit sales fall, they typically fall before the prices do. So that's the slowing momentum, and it'll be a sign of the things to come. So when momentum slows, depending on how quickly and the severity of the cascading consequence, it might take 2 to 4 years for this to bottom out. If it proceeds like, you know, if you're going to throw noodles at a wall and there isn't an extreme pivot on recovery, it could take 2 to 4 years, maybe a little longer. So, and then it may take double that to climb out. So we're like 2 to 4 years in, 2 to 4 years out to see any meaningful gains. So given all that, it's like a shock to our system, and it's the corona climate. So this may be the best time in the next 10 years to sell your house. Like it's even given me pause. I don't want to move that. I like it here. And what is there to do to preserve equity position? And what's the long-term plan? And do you have what you need? Does your living circumstance, so you don't sell, you sell, you need to live someplace. So it's really a matter of how you look at preserving equity and what your needs are. People are still relocating. There's still job changes. The Denver market is oddly healthy for the circumstance, and we have our circumstance. So I'm not saying, hey, look at us go. It's not like that. So there are many, many things to consider. And it's just a question of whether you want to hunker down and write it out. So honestly, if you're thinking about selling your house in the next 10 years, and the most important consideration with everything going on is getting the absolute best price, when should you sell? And it looks like now. And it looks like right now. Now's the best time to make your move. Things to consider. It's always something, right? Anyway, so if you missed last week's episode, should I wait to buy? How interesting, right? Click on the tab that says video, and you'll see it there. Next Thursday's video is how to get your house ready to sell. We'll talk about the physical condition and how to make it look nice. And then we'll go through all the things that aren't so visible to someone who's getting ready to sell their home, and we'll get you ready. So we'll see you next Thursday.